Hello, everybody. I'm back again, this time for a second class on the work of Angela Carter. We started last week with her collection of short stories called The Bloody Chamber, and we looked at her shortest story in that collection called The Snow Child, which was Carter's take on Snow White. Today, in the second shorter recorded class, I'm going to be covering the story The Company of Wolves. This is one of Carter's more well-known stories. It's been turned into a movie. I shared the clip of the trailer as well as the full movie link the other day that you can watch if you have some time. It's just for your own interest, your own edification and enjoyment. Today we'll actually cover the short story itself. It's only about 10 pages long. I'm hoping this class is something I can do quite quickly. So I'm going to get straight into it. So a reminder last week that we covered the overarching themes in Carter's work. She uses a lot of, she basically kind of retells or redoes or reimagines familiar fairy tales, puts a very adult and modern spin on them. And her intention, in her own words, is to draw out the hidden, latent meanings or ideas or themes within those stories, saying that these ideas exist in there under the surface, and she, Carter, is bringing them out and repurposing them for a modern day audience to connect with. The Company of Wolves, as you might have learned already, is Carter's version of Little Red Riding Hood. Again, when I say version or retelling or reimagining, I don't mean that Carter's going to directly retell the story. Her fairy tales are kind of inspired by the originals, and she takes a lot of license in how she chooses to tell these stories for us again. So you can't really see them as being like her retelling as such, but they are inspired by, perhaps is the better word. In this story, she really focuses on some very interesting parts, I think, of the original fairy tale. Whenever I teach this, I like to talk to people about, or get people thinking about their own relations to animals, specifically relationships you might have to dogs, the most domesticated and, in a way, human-like animal that we have. The dog, or Canis familiaris, is a direct descendant of the grey wolf, Canis lupus. In other words, dogs, as we know them, are basically domesticated wolves, right? Even that little pug you've got, or the Jack Russell, comes from somewhere, and it begins in a relationship that goes, some say, goes back as long as 15,000 years, when human beings first domesticated wolves. They became, over time, dogs, and the dogs were servants to us. They were hunting partners, but also became familiaris. They became something that is familiar to us. And if you look in the eyes of a dog's eyes are very human. They're a lot like a familiar's eyes, somebody in your family, a familiar. So it's as though the dog, of all the other creatures from the animal kingdom, is the most human-like of them all, man's best friend. But still, there's something about them that is wolf-like. You know, a wolf is a predator, so at once familiar, but also slightly suspect as well, right? So think about it in those terms. This is the idea that Kant is playing with. Little Red Riding Hood being hunted or preyed upon by the wolf, but wolf is also something familiar, something friendly, so it's ambiguous. And there's that old Carter approach again of taking something and showing you both sides of it, the dark and the light, the good and the bad. And in the story, you can look out for the following themes coming through. Same as in The Snow Child, as I mentioned last time, these shifting balances of power between the characters, which I'll explore soon in the story itself. In this particular one, she really goes all in on desire, sexuality, and violence, and how these things are all kind of linked together, how they all overlap, and they're all going on at the same time within the human mind and body. How she mixes that with animals and dogs, wolves in particular, is deeply unsettling and quite disturbing. But as I said to you last time, she does it for a reason. It's not some kind of sick game she's playing. She wants to change your mind about something, or get you thinking, trying to change your mind on something, perhaps too. I also would like you to remember that I've kind of already said this, that um, Kant is trying to excavate this latent meaning or energy from the fairy tales and trying to repurpose it into something new for a modern audience, right? So let's get looking at the story. This was published in 1979, so quite a long time ago. And as we read it, I would like you to think not just of the themes I've spoken about already, but also think of it in terms of how Carter subverts or transgresses or goes against the norms that we are used to. What assumptions does she overturn? Here she's taking a very familiar, kind of quote unquote safe, well known fairy tale of innocence, of girlhood, and she's turning it into something much darker, with a much darker, harder edge to it, in which Little Red Riding Hood is not the girl you think she is, and she's also, and the wolf is not quite the creature you also think he is. The setup of Little Red Riding Hood is that we've got girl versus predator, and perhaps the moral of that fairy tale is be careful who you talk to. Stranger danger. Watch out when you go off into the woods alone. Perhaps don't do that because danger lurks out there. That's a message that for centuries, for thousands of years, human adults were giving to their children, to their kin. Be careful. The world is dangerous. There are predators out there and they wish to kill you and eat you. Children who disappear alone into the woods tend not to come back. So it's a warning story, and it's a story of how humans are put into danger, how they are predated upon. In this story, Carter turns that around and says the human being, especially the human girl, is not as weak as you think she is. So let's explore how that all happens in the story. I'll come back to some slides later on to wrap up, but I'm going to share my screen and work with a PDF that I've got here, or I had anyway, so I'm just going to bring it back up on my side. I'm just going to share my screen here, almost there. And you should be able to see a PDF that I've got here. This is even the same page numbers as your book. So this story starts on page 129 of your prescribed reading. It's called Company of Wolves. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'm really just going to kind of go over the parts that I've highlighted. The story happens in, I would say, 3 sections. The first few pages, the first 3 or 4 pages, Carter introduces us to this world. It's kind of a mix of a fantasy and a real world. We don't really know what time period it's set in or where in the world this is happening, just somewhere in the northern hemisphere, somewhere maybe in Europe. She begins by saying that one beast and only one howls in the woods by night. The wolf is carnivore incarnate, and he's as cunning as he is ferocious. Once he's had a taste of flesh, then nothing else will do. At night, the eyes of the wolves shine like candle flames, yellowish, reddish, but that is because the pupils of their eyes fatten on darkness and catch the light from your lantern to flash it back to you. Red for danger. If a wolf's eyes reflect only moonlight, then they gleam a cold and an unnatural green, a mineral or piercing color. If the benighted traveler spies those luminous, terrible sequins stitched suddenly on the black thickets, then he knows he must run. If fear has not struck him, stock still. So you can just get a sense of Carter's writing. It's very lyrical, poetic, and image-based. In the story, she works a lot with this idea of eyes. I mentioned the eyes of the dog earlier. Now, eyes are things that you see with, of course, but with a wolf, eyes are also things that reflect back at you. A light literally bounces off a wolf's retina and returns to sender. That's why wolf's eyes will glow, because you see the light coming back off their eyes, like a cat's eyes in the street, same thing. And that idea of a reflection is interesting because already she set it up that these wolves are beasts, that they're in a way monsters, carnivore, meat eaters, and that they want flesh and nothing else will do, preferably human flesh. But when we look at a wolf, we see a reflection, a literal reflection, but maybe also a metaphorical reflection, that we see ourselves reflected in them too. We see our own beastly nature coming back at us because we human beings, of course, we are animals as well. And she goes to quite great pains to set up this whole world she's in. She almost gives us like a history of how wolves operate in this particular um, region. And um, one of the things she does is she mixes like folklore in with it, kind of elements of fantasy. And that introduces us not just to the wolf as a creature, but the wolf as a man. Okay, wolf as a kind of half animal, half man. It says here on page 130, um, fear and flee the wolf, for worst of all, the wolf may be more than he seems. Here introduces the idea that human beings, men specifically, the males, can turn into wolves in multiple different ways. They can be cursed, or they can become a wolf, and that's a trope from many stories. Perhaps best embodied by the idea of the werewolf, the man who involuntarily, beyond his control, will turn into this creature, this monster, half man, half wolf, and then carry out, a series of crimes, usually against women, when his human mind is switched off, and then he'll transform back and have no memory of what he did. Right. So that's something she's playing with here. This idea of transformation, of change, of how wolves exist, men exist, but there's some halfway point between them, a transitory liminal place where they intersect and kind of become each other. So that you could start to see that as a metaphor, that in the original story, the wolf is a predator. In this story, males in the world, are predators, kind of products, I guess, of a patriarchal environment, you could perhaps say. This paragraph stuck out for me just as a way she kind of captures the sad condition of what it means to be a wolf. She writes, that long drawn, wavering howl has, for all its fearful resonance, some inherent sadness in it, as if the beasts would love to be less beastly if only they knew how, and never cease to mourn their own condition. There is a vast melancholy in the canticles of wolves, melancholy infinite as the forest, endless as these long nights of winter, and yet that ghastly sadness, that mourning for their own irredeemable appetites, can never move the heart, for not one phrase in it hints at the possibility of redemption. Grace could not come to the wolf from its own despair, only through some external mediator, so that sometimes the beast will look as if he half welcomes the knife that dispatches him. Right? So the wolf is a sad creature because it's condemned to being a beast. Carter's also saying, as we'll see in the rest of the story, that males, are the same. We are kind of condemned to our own beastly nature, distinct from women, right? So playing around here with that idea of male as predator, male as warrior, as fighter, and woman as kind of softer, gentler, and more of a caretaker. That's the kind of cliche she's playing with, which will soon be turned around and changed. I also wanted to quickly play this for you. I hope this is playing on your side, but it's a video in which let me just stop sharing this page and I'll come back here. I think it's kind of instructive and interesting to listen to. It's a video I found of 25 wolves howling. I won't play the whole thing, but it's compare this to what Carter's just written on the page. It's very eerily the same. Eerie stuff, isn't it? And just the way, compared to the description that Carter gives us, that very sad, long, drawn out howl from the wolves, the wavering howl. It's fearful, it's scary, but also got this inherent sadness in it, as though the beasts know that they are beasts and always will be, right? So that also just shows you how good a writer Carter is. She's really capturing accurately something, playing with these fantastical elements, but also trying to say something very serious and true. Other parts of the story go into the kind of folklore of the story, talking about how men can be turned into werewolves and back again. And she uses an interesting word here. Before he can become a wolf, a lycanthrope strips stark naked. If you spy a naked man among the pines, you must run as if the devil were after you. Lycanthrope, and I'll talk about this again a bit later, is basically a wolf man. Lycan means wolf, thrope means man. So what she's inviting us to think of here is the wolves not as your humble little domesticated dog, and not quite as the mindless predator out there in the woods, but rather as a lycanthrope, as a creature somewhere in between man and wolf. That's the wolf she creates in this Little Red Riding Hood story. Okay, and then we're duly introduced on page 132 to Little Red Riding Hood, and she again is not quite the Little Red Riding Hood we are so familiar with. She's much more mature. She's a bit stronger and strong-willed. And for example, look at how she is described. Some things here are very important to pay attention to because they suggest a lot about what Carter's intentions are. It is midwinter, and the robin, the friend of man, sits on the handle of the gardener's blade and sings. It is the worst time in all the year for wolves, but this strong-minded child insists she will go off through the wood. She is quite sure the wild beasts cannot harm her. Although well warned, she lays a carving knife in the basket her mother has packed with cheeses. And this is something she's taking off to her grandmother's house. So just to pause on a couple of ideas here. One, midwinter. Okay. Basically, it's a time in the year right in the middle of winter. She also describes it as being the solstice, right? The solstice is the longest night in winter, but the solstice is also the hinge point between winter and spring and the coming of summer. So basically the solstice is the moment winter's at its worst, but also the moment we all are also past getting winter. So we're headed into the summer. So it's this very transitory period between seasons. And this idea of transitions, of changing, of turning around things is a theme she's working with all the time. She keeps on using words and ideas that hint to this idea of change, of transitoriness. And Little Red Riding Hood is much changed in the story. Here she is, one, strong-minded, she's insistent, and she is well warned, but also well armed. She's got a knife with her. So she's off to Granny to deliver the basket of goodies. But this is not your regular Little Red Riding Hood. She's more of like she's basically a badass or something. You know, she's strong-willed, independent, clever, and she's got a knife she's ready to kill. The malign door of the salsa swings upon its hinges, and she has been much too loved ever to feel scared. So this is not a fearful Little Red Riding Hood. This is very different to the original fairy tale, where she is way more of a passive, innocent little girl. Here, she's basically coming into her adulthood. Here, Carter describes how she's basically becoming a woman. She's just hit puberty, and so she's not a child anymore. She's not an adult either. She's somewhere in between, like maybe we'd call her a teenager or a tween or something like that. So she's also in a transition. The character of Red Riding Hood is transitioning from one state to another. And I'm sure, as we all know, you go through puberty, the hormones hit, the body changes, it almost transforms you into a different person. And it's involuntary. You can't control it. And so much of the story is about giving in to things you can't control. You can't control the seasons. You can't control turning into a werewolf. You can't control turning into a teenager. You can't control what other people do to you. And you kind of instead have to give yourself up to this rampant set of impulses. And in going with it, so you turn into something good and healthy. So the story goes anyway. The forest closed upon her like a pair of jaws, so that indicates a bit of foreshadowing there. We know it's coming, and Carter's really reinforcing it. And what happens to is the typical Red Riding Hood story. She bumps into a very handsome young man, and soon they are laughing and joking like old friends. He's carrying an object in his pocket, which is a compass. And if you read this kind of carefully, you'll see that the relationship they have immediately is a relationship of equals. Okay. For example, she doesn't see a naked man or a wolf. So this is a human. He is a human man, but he is a man as well. It's an adult man, where she is just a young girl. But their relationship is one of equals. They're joking around, they're flirting, they're having a good time. He pulls out his compass and says, why don't we have a bet on something? And he laughed at her again. Gleaming trails of spittle clung to his teeth. It's an image that is very closely linked to dogs and wolves. So she's kind of suggesting this guy, this handsome man, he is the wolf in a man's clothing or a man's guise. He's both. He's male and wolf. He's good and he's predator at the same time. So they take a bet that he, the huntsman, the young man, will be able to arrive at Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother before she does. Okay. Is it a bet? He asked her. Shall we make a game of it? What will you give me if I get to your grandmother's house before you? What would you like? She asked disingenuously. Disingenuously means she asks like fakely. She's kind of in control of the conversation, and she's suggesting to him that he can ask for whatever he wants. And he says, a kiss. Commonplaces of rustic seduction. She lowered her eyes and blushed. He went through the undergrowth and took her basket with him, but she forgot to be afraid of the beasts. Although now the moon was rising, for she wanted to dawdle on her way to make sure the handsome gentleman would win his wager. So she wants the kiss. She is like, as we see here, she's not your regular Red Riding Hood. She is, in a way, mature. and she's coming into her maturity, and she wants to do things that mature people do, which is to get kissed by men they are attracted to, right? Anyway, the huntsman gets there before she does, and as he does so, you'll notice how she plays around with all of these kind of wolf-like, werewolf-like images. There is a faint trace of blood on his chin. He has been snacking on his catch. And when he gets to Granny's house, he rapped upon the panels with his knuckles. Aged and frail Granny is 3/4 succumbed to the mortality the ache in her bones promises her, and almost ready to give in entirely. So she's very old. Granny is very old. And you've got this playoff here between Little Red Riding Hood, who's just becoming an adult, but very young, and the very old. So it's like the older generation is falling away, and the young ones are coming through. And the norms and the desires of the young ones are replacing the old. And it says again, he rapped upon the panels with his hairy knuckles. So men can have hairy knuckles, but again, this idea of hairy knuckles is intimating that this man is something like a wolf. She never ever describes him as actually being one, but she may as well be. So we as the reader are not exactly sure what we're looking at when we consider this young man. Is he male? Is he human? Sorry, is he a human male or is he a male wolf? The answer is both and neither. It is your granddaughter, he mimicked in a high soprano. Lift up the latch and walk in, my darling. You can tell them by their eyes. Eyes of a beast of prey, nocturnal, devastating eyes as red as a wound. You can hurl your Bible at him and your apron after Granny. You thought that was a sure prophylactic against these infernal vermin. Now call on Christ and his mother and all the angels in heaven to protect you, but it won't do you any good. Off with his disguise, that coat of forest-colored cloth, the hat with the feather tucked into the ribbon. His matted hair streams down his white shirt, and you can see the lice moving in it. The sticks of the hearth shift and hiss. Night and the forest have come into the kitchen with darkness tangled in its hair. He strips off his shirt. His skin is the color and texture of vellum. A crisp stripe of hair runs down his belly. His nipples are ripe and as dark as a poison fruit, but he's so thin you can count the ribs under his skin, as if only he gave you the time. He strips off his trousers, and she can see how hairy his legs are. His genitals huge, huge. The last thing the old lady saw in all this world was a young man, eyes like cinders, naked as stone, approaching her bed. The wolf is carnivore incarnate. So what is this guy? What is this man who's just gained the attention of Little Red Riding Hood, but who's now also about to gobble up Granny? He's human, but he's monster. He's human, but he's also wolf. He's a werewolf. He's something in between, just like the season is in between, just like Little Red Riding Hood is in between. So he is in a state of being both things at the same time. And the idea is that, in a way, perhaps what Carter's saying is that that is what men are specifically. Men are kind of outwardly can look like gentlemen and young, strapping, polite fellows with good looks and charming manners, but underneath the disguise lies something very different, right? So this is a metaphor that she's playing with. When he had finished with her, he licked his chops and quickly dressed himself again. So we don't know what exactly is meant by when he had finished with her. We don't know what he actually does to her. There's many things he could do with her, many violent things he could just have done. But the intimation is he's killed her. He's eaten her up and stuck her bones under the bed, shall we say. And that, of course, is the cue for Little Red Riding Hood to turn up. And she does. Rat-a-tat-tap on the door. So what's going to happen? Because he's wolf, but she, Little Red Riding Hood, has been attracted to him. Little Red Riding Hood has a knife. There is no sense that another male is going to come into the scene and save her from the wolf, as happens in the original. She is on her own. Granny's gone, and she's going to have to take care of the situation. But what is she going to do? How is she going to do it? How is she going to get out of this perilous situation where she's about to die? And the way Carter, sets it all up is, again, very like, I guess there's no other word for it but to say that it's kind of sexual and flirtatious. When she comes into the cottage, she realizes that she's in danger. When the girl saw that, she knew she was in danger of death. Where is my grandmother? There's nobody here but we two, my darling. Now a great howling rose up all around them, near, very near, as close as the kitchen garden, the howling of a multitude of wolves. So I just played that video for you, and this is why in this scene you've got to imagine all of these wolves going up howling, 10, 15, 20 wolves all howling at once. Imagine how scary and strange and eerie that sound would be. She knew the worst wolves are hairy on the inside, and she shivered in spite of the scarlet shawl she pulled more closely round herself as if it could protect her. Although it was as red as the blood she must spill. Who has come to sing us carols? She said. Those are the voices of my brothers, darling. I love the company of wolves. Look out the window, and you'll see them. Snow half-caked the lattice, and she opened it to look into the garden. It was a white night of moon and snow. The blizzard whirled round the gaunt grey beasts who squatted on their haunches among the rows of winter cabbage, pointing their sharp snouts to the moon and howling as if their hearts would break. 10 wolves, 20 wolves, so many wolves she could not count them, howling in concert as if demented or deranged. Their eyes reflected the light from the kitchen and shone like 100 candles. It is very cold, poor thing, she said. No wonder they howl so. So a couple of interesting things here. One, despite the kind of scary situation she's in, she's very calm, and she feels sorry for the creature. She's not afraid. She's not screaming. She's not running away. She's actually very determined and ice cold. It is very cold, poor things. No wonder they howl so. I also wanted to just mention how the wolf slash man says, I love the company of wolves. That obviously gives the story its title. So there's got to be something about this line that Carter likes or wants to emphasize. And you think of the word company. Company means to be in friendship with something. If you have a companion can be a friend, a lover, a girlfriend, a wife, a confidant, somebody who keeps you company. It's a companion is something warm and friendly and desirable. The company of wolves is in a way here being used to suggest wolves are my friend, or wolves are our friends in some ways. But when said in this situation, doesn't really fit, because the wolves here are enemies. The wolf here wants to eat Little Red Riding Hood, wants to kill her. What's going to happen? She closed the window in the wolf's threnody. A threnody is just a very sad song, and took off her scarlet shawl, the color of poppies, the color of sacrifices, the color of her menzies, and since her fear did her no good, she ceased to be afraid. And then she actually starts taking off all of her clothes. So, okay, now what's happening, right? She bundles up her shawl, Little Red Riding Hood. Her riding hood is what she takes off. That's her shawl. And she throws it onto the fire, which instantly consumed it. So that's like, I'm throwing off the very title of the story that I come from, and I'm sending it into the fire to burn up. It's like Carter is saying, the old fairy tale is gone and it's destroyed, and we're in a new, more unpredictable territory now. And then she takes off all of her clothes into what shall I do with my blouse? Into the fire too. The thin muslin went flaring up the chimney like a magic bird, and now off came her skirt, her woolen stockings, her shoes, and onto the fire they went too, and were gone for good. Also think about clothes are things that you wear as a form of protection, but also as an identity. clothes are a way you suggest to the world how you want to be seen and what you are. So in taking off her clothes like this, it's, yes, it's a kind of a sexual thing, but it's also the sense that she's getting rid of an old identity and she's turning into something else. Then she went directly to the man with the red eyes. So there's a man, but not quite, because look how she's about to describe him. She went directly to the man with the red eyes, in whose unkempt mane the lice moved. So now it's got an unkempt mane as well. She stood up on tiptoe and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. What big arms you have, all the better to hug you with. Every wolf in the world now howled a prothalamion outside the window as she freely gave the kiss she owed him. What big teeth you have. She saw how his jaw began to slaver, and the room was full of the clamour of the forest's Lieber's taunt. But the wise child never flinched, even when he answered, all the better to eat you with. The girl burst out laughing. She knew she was nobody's meat. She laughed at him full in the face. She ripped off his shirt for him and flung it into the fire, in the fiery wake of her own discarded clothing. The flames danced like dead souls on Walpurgis Nacht, and the old bones under the bed had set up a terrible clattering. But she did not pay them any heed. Carnivore incarnate, only immaculate flesh appeases him. So look at all the things she's done. She's really put a twist in the story here. Again, she's kind of changing the very sacred nature of this original fairy tale. She keeps this what big teeth you have, what big arms you have, but in her telling they become these flirtations. And it's done at the instigation of Red Riding Hood, right? She's the one who kisses him, or kisses it, this half man, half wolf thing. And although he's a man, he's got a jaw that slavers. He's got a mane full of lice. And she, the wise child, doesn't recoil. She's not afraid. She doesn't flinch. In fact, she bursts out laughing at the ridiculous idea that it's the man/wolf who might be in charge. She's the one calling the shots now. She's the one who wants to do the unspeakable, do the dirty to the wolf, rather than the other way around. She, Little Red Riding Hood, has become the predator, has become the carnivore incarnate instead. And how it ends is pretty gross/weird. She will lay his fearful head on her lap, and she will pick out the lice from his pelt, and perhaps she will put the lice into her mouth and eat them, as he will bid her, as she would do in a savage marriage ceremony. The blizzard will die down. The blizzard died down, leaving the mountains as randomly covered with snow as if a blind woman had thrown a sheet over them. The upper branches of the forest pines, limed, creaking, swollen with the fall. Snowlight, moonlight, a confusion of paw prints, all silent or still. Midnight, and the clock strikes. It is Christmas Day, the werewolf's birthday. The door of the solstice stands wide open. Let them all sink through. See, sweet and sound, she sleeps in Granny's bed between the paws of the tender wolf. So she has turned the savage wolf, the predator, the male predator, the man, into something tender, something that is capable of love, that is in a way domesticated. The wolf has become domesticated by the girl. The kind of dark, dangerous, murderous male energy has been turned into something tame by the act of the girl transitioning into a woman through this almost like ritualistic religious ceremony involving God knows what. We are left to infer it must be sex. And that's interesting in a metaphorical level, but when you really think about it, what we've just read here is a story in which a girl has sex with a wolf, with a dog. And that's like super strange and quite disturbing, even for our own kind of period of here in 2024. It's quite a shocking thing to say. It's a kind of a shocking realization once you've read the story that that's actually what's happened. And like I said, the story is all about transitions and changes and how important those are. What the story means can be, it's so open for interpretation. I mean, you can see this any which way you want to. The way I kind of see it is, I'm just going to come back to my slides here, is captured, I think, by the following statement. And that Carter is basically using the myth of lycanthropy, of werewolves, as a way of exploring the beastly aspects of male violence towards women, especially wives. Now, every man has a wolf within him, which, if he cannot tame it himself, the woman might be able to, as indeed the girl at the end of Carter's story succeeds in doing. So it kind of is this turnaround of what you expect in the male-female relationship. The male is dangerous, highly physical, highly sexual. But in this story, Carter, it's the other way around. The girl, becoming a woman, takes the male and, in a sense, tames him or neuters him or brings him under control in some way. And that is a very different way to see the power relations between the genders, isn't it? That actually it's the woman who calls the shots, not the man. The man isn't the one really in charge of things. The woman is in charge of things. And that's a kind of, I guess, an obvious feminist message. And it's a surprising message. And it's wrapped up in this very shocking provocational idea or story of girls, men, wolves, violence, sexual violence, desire, wrapped up in that whole heady mix, that metaphor. It's a kind of a sensation that really whacks you between the eyes powerfully when you realize what you just read. And so it gets you to think, it gets you to reevaluate things, which is really what Carter's all about, asking you to see things in a different way by really, whacking you over the top of the head with something quite extreme. So as you read the rest of the prescribed stories, you've got to see her work in that same way. We are going to be moving on in the next class to the title story called The Bloody Chamber. We'll probably spend about 2 classes in that, 1 live class and then 1 recorded class that we'll do. It's the longer story, so it'll take a while to get through. But you're looking at the same thing. What are these reversals? What latent idea does she take and then use it to subvert what your expectations are, especially around what you think are normal behaviors for a woman, okay? And also think, like, again, what is shocking or even gross about that story? The Bloody Chamber specifically. That's what Carter's using often to really, really surprise us and mess with our heads a little bit. Okay, I've gone way too long as usual. Hope you've been able to listen all the way through. Hope you're reading the stories. I'll see you again next Wednesday when we look at the Bloody Chamber in live class. If you're still here, a reminder that tomorrow, Thursday, the 29th of August at 7 o'clock, there's going to be an NSS. I know I said I would do an assignment breakdown, but I didn't know that actually the lead tutor is responsible for doing that. So she will be leading that tomorrow night at 7. I'll be on the call so I can take any questions that you might have about part 1. I'll leave it there. Cheers, guys. Stay well. Keep reading.